A cathedral city in the heart of the Midlands, the site of England's first factory, but essentially a market town. Its ancient streets still follow patterns laid down by the Danes over 1,000 years ago.
Well, have you guessed where we are yet? The Romans called this place Derventio, and the river Derwent runs through it, and so does the traffic. The Saxons called it Northworthy, but it was as one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw that Derby came to prominence. They called it Deoraby, or Deoraby, which means the abode of the deer. And the streets are still called gates, like Friargate here, which was the Danish word for street.
Friargate was designated as the city's first conservation area in 1969. Mostly Georgian in character, this ancient tree-lined route has no less than 65 listed buildings, as well as this iron bridge built in 1878 for the Great Northern Railway. Cast by the local firm of Handyside and Company, the beautifully decorated bridge has 2 spans to carry the lines which were taken up in the early 60s. Handysides gained a worldwide reputation during the 19th century for bridges like this, but it's perhaps less well known that most of England's Victorian pillar boxes were also made by the same firm here in Derby.
Like any city today, Derby is battered by traffic, but since the days when I used to come here as a child, they have built in a ring road, and that's eased some of the problems. But it did mean that they had to demolish some of the town's oldest streets.
Medieval Bridgegate was one of them, and yet at the bottom of it, tucked away between the modern ring road and an 18th century road bridge, is a remarkable survivor, St Mary's Chapel on the Bridge. One of only a handful of bridge chapels known to survive in the country, it dates from the 14th century. In it, a chaplain would have said Mass for the benefit and safety of travellers, because the Trent and Derwent often changed course, and beyond them lay forests, wolves and robbers. This wall plaque records the martyrdom of 3 priests in 1588. Their quartered remains were suspended on poles at the end of the bridge, until stolen for burial by Catholic sympathisers. The house attached to the chapel is an elegant structure of the 17th century, and high up on the wall, notice the Guardian fire mark. In the early days of firefighting, insurance companies ran their own brigades, and premises not showing the right mark were often left to burn.
It is down by the riverside, you know, that Derby's origins as an industrial town began. Because in 1702, a Derby engineer built a water-powered silk spinning mill for a Mr. Cotchett.
At this time, the British textile industry was a domestic affair, with workers spinning and weaving at home and supplying merchants through a system of middlemen. Cotchett's venture was not a success, but this much larger mill was built by the same engineer for one Thomas Lom. By concentrating some 300 people working complex machinery in one building, Derby's silk mill has earned its place in history as the world's first true factory.
As for Lom, well, the story goes that he learnt the art of spinning silk from the Italian masters of that craft when he visited that country and bribed the workers. He died in 1722, aged 28, poisoned, it is said, by an Italian woman sent over by the manufacturers whose secrets he'd stolen.
Since 1974, the mill has been the home of Derby's Industrial Museum. Its original gates, made by the local wrought iron master Robert Bakewell, now frame the giant Rolls-Royce RB211 engine, which dominates the museum's ground floor gallery and its Rolls-Royce collection.
We're really starting at the wrong end, aren't we, Brian? Looking at the RB211, if we're going to talk about the history of your aero engines here, this must be the latest one you got, isn't it?
Well, latest, it's true, and probably the most spectacular, but in actual fact, as far as we're concerned, history begins yesterday, and this can be applied to aero engines. But in the collection that we've got here, we go right back to the beginnings of the Rolls-Royce aero engine story, which starts in 1915. And on the way up from the Eagle of 1915 to the RB211, we've got some pretty spectacular milestones.
How did you manage to get hold of this one?
Well, it's got a very interesting story, in fact. We got it from the customer training school at the works, but it was fortunate, really, that it was saved there, because the engine was originally manufactured in 1971, and it was delivered to Lockheed's in December that year, was fitted on the second TriStar on the starboard wing, where it flew 150 flights. And then it was used for ground proving trials. It was fitted on the prototype TriStar and flew on that for 35 flights. And then it was taken out of service in 1973.
So it's very much earned its wings then?
It has, but it's a standard production engine.
You mentioned the Eagle engine earlier. Is that the earliest engine you have in the museum?
Yes, the Eagle 1, the original Eagle, was the first engine that the company made. The particular Eagle that we've got in the collection is one of the two Eagles from the Vickers Vimy that Olcott and Brown flew across the Atlantic in 1919.
The very one?
Yes. Yeah.
My eye was drawn when we were walking through immediately to that Spitfire engine. The size of the thing surprised me for a start, to think of that massive engine in a relatively small plane.
Yes, it's a rather drab-looking engine in the gallery, but that particular one's got quite a history as well. It flew in 1940 to 42, and it was in 4 different aircraft, a Spitfire, 2 Hurricanes and a Defiant. And so there's a lot of nostalgia attached to that particular one as well.
And another important aircraft I know that you wanted to show me was your first turboprop, is that the right expression?
That's correct, yes. A lot of people don't realise that, in fact, the world's first turboprop aircraft flight was from Church Broughton in 1945. It was a converted Meteor fighter, which had 2 Rolls-Royce Trent engines fitted. And peculiar, really, because the Trent, the first turboprop, was really a Derwent engine with a big gearbox and a propeller on the front.
You know, there are so many engines one could talk about, but I can't think of any town or city of comparable size to Derby that's got such a tremendous thing to be proud of, its contribution to aviation, can you?
Well, I think as aero engine collections go, this one's just about unique, because it does show one manufacturer's products right the way through.
Iron foundry work and a restored handyside pillar box are just some of the displays in the museum's upper gallery. Hand-frame knitting machines recall the Industrial Revolution and the factory system carried on by Derbyshire's early industrialists. There's even what they call a brick library, an eye-catching selection of products from the local clay quarries. It's from just outside the silk mill that today, thanks to the demolition of a power station, you get the best view of the city's tallest building, Derby Cathedral. And a walk around the shady precincts leaves the visitor in no doubt that the present building successfully combines architectural styles which range over 500 years. The great medieval tower, the second highest in England, dominates most of the long-distance views of Derby. Begun in 1511, when Henry VIII was on the throne and the English Church still a province of Rome, it stands now much as it did when completed. 212 feet to the top of the pinnacles and a mere 189 steps to the roof. The words young men and maidens appear along this fascia on the south side of the tower, supporting, or more likely originating, the local tradition that the tower up to this height was paid for by the young people of the town.
It was, though, in 1723 that the then vicar, Dr. Hutchinson, did something which had a profound effect on this city and on the Church of All Saints. Acting on his own initiative, at the crack of dawn on February the 18th, he opened the church doors to an army of workmen with pickaxes. And before most of the citizens of Derby were out of bed, there was very little left of the nave of their church.
Architect James Gibbs set to work, and his design for the new nave successfully bridged a 200-year gap in the development of architecture between the 16th and 18th centuries. The light streams in through the high rounded windows, and elegant plaster pillars support the rounded roof. Dividing the nave from the chancel is a magnificent wrought iron screen by Robert Bakewell of Derby. Bearing the Hanoverian royal arms, the screen was part of James Gibbs's original scheme for the church. It stretches across the entire width of the building, mounting in the centre to form an arch over the gates which lead towards the sanctuary. Derby's parish church became a cathedral in 1927 when the Diocese of Derby was created, and the building was soon found to be a little cramped for its new role. Enlarged and restored in white and gold by Sebastian Comper, it retains the rectangular design of James Gibbs, but by opening up the east wall to form a retrochoir, adds a further dimension of light and space to frame the great baldacchino which stands over the high altar. On either side are the only two coloured windows in the building, designed by the late Seri Richards. Representing in abstract terms all souls and all saints, the darkness and the chaos of one striking a contrast to the light and clarity of the other. An object of great curiosity across the centuries in Derby Cathedral has been this monument, and it seems to me to say a lot about power and money in 16th century England. It's a monument to Elizabeth, the Countess of Shrewsbury, better known as Bess of Hardwicke. She was married 4 times. Each of her husbands was powerful and influential in the land and at court. She was immensely rich. She was, unusually for her time, a woman who was a dealer. She dealt in timber and lead. But in the end, after building several great houses, she died without a friend. With admirable foresight, she erected this monument well before her death. In fact, she spent a small fortune on it and often came to admire the huge projecting tomb with its pillars reaching up to the roof and supporting the great canopy adorned with stags and shields. Her stately figure lies on it, apparelled in costly dress. Over her embroidered black gown flows a crimson mantle lined with gold. A small ruff is about her neck, and a coronet about her brow rests on a cushion. She came to look on her monument for the last time in 1607, at the ripe old age of 89, and must have observed with satisfaction the long Latin inscription telling of her 4 husbands and the great houses they left her. Well, we can't leave All Saints without telling you about Derby's 18th century rope sliders. It seems that a young chap called Robert Cadman in 1732 came up to the top of the tower here, which is getting on for 200 feet, and secured a rope which crossed the yawning gulf between here to St. Michael's Church down at the bottom there. And what he did was to fix some kind of wooden breastplate upon himself, which I suppose had got a groove in it or something, climbed out and let go. He went sliding down to St. Michael's Church, blowing a trumpet and firing a pistol, and it took him 8 seconds from top to bottom. Unfortunately, the daring young man was killed doing the same stunt at Shrewsbury, but that didn't seem to put people off, because a couple of years later, another daredevil arrived up here at the top of the tower, and he slung a rope from here down to the end of St. Mary's Gate, which must be about 200 yards. A vast crowd of people, as you might expect, came to watch. So let's go down and see it from their point of view. This time, not only did the man slide down the rope, pulling a 13-year-old boy in a wheelbarrow, but a donkey made the trip as well. We're not sure how they got the poor beast up there, but it was there on top of the tower, braying across the town. It too was protected by a wooden breastplate and weighed down by half a hundredweight of lead around its legs. Well, the stunt went very well until, you've guessed it, the rope broke at the cathedral end, bringing down chimneys in the street, scattering people on the ground, and the donkey came thundering down as well, weighed down by all its lead. Fortunately, no one was killed. Even the donkey wasn't hurt, presumably because it landed on such a lot of lovely soft bodies on the pavement. Just across the road from where Derby's first flyer landed is John Smith's Clockworks, and the chances are that if your town hall clock wasn't made by one of the Smith group of companies, they certainly keep it going. The firm was founded in 1856 by the first John Smith, a clockmaker who'd been apprenticed to the famous Whitehurst family of Derby. The St Paul's Cathedral clock, Great Tom, was made and installed by the firm, and in 1956 they completely restored the 14th century clock at Salisbury Cathedral, using many of the old craft methods. Nowadays the firm maintains more than 4,500 public clocks all over the country, and designs and manufactures pillar, projecting and floral clocks. As for the original John Whitehurst, he was an inventive craftsman of the best kind. This portrait is by the city's most celebrated artist, internationally known as Wright of Derby. Born at number 28 Irongate, Joseph Wright excelled in painting moonlight and firelight scenes, and as David Fraser, keeper of art at Derby Museum, explains, also recorded the contemporary interest in matters scientific and technical.
I think it was a personal interest for a start. He had a number of friends who were involved in science and industry, members of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which was an intellectual circle comprising people like Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin.
Yes, they all met on the night of the full moon, didn't they?
That's right, and called themselves lunatics. Yes.
And the painting that really hits one between the eyes when you walk into this gallery is that magnificent one. It appears to be an astronomical picture. What's it all about?
The picture depicts a man giving a lecture on an instrument called an orrery, which was a sort of planetarium invented at the beginning of the 18th century. It's set in a darkened room and lit by a candle set in place of the sun. And we believe this is because the lecturer was demonstrating an eclipse, and round him you have a group of people. In fact, it's a domestic scene rather than an academic lecture, and I think this is a measure of the tremendous importance that people played on scientific education in the 18th century.
What about his portraiture? Was that the way he perhaps earned his bread and butter?
Yes, he started off as a portraitist because in the middle of the 18th century that was the most reliable way to make a living. There were always people who wanted pictures of themselves to hang on the walls.
They seem to be particularly animated as well, not really like the stiff and stylized portraits that you might see.
No, it was really another of Wright's characteristics was to give his portrait groups some sort of psychological activity, to unify them, to give them some, as you call it, animation.
What were this lot doing?
Well, they're comparing a drawing to something in the landscape. Really, the subject is a sketching trip in the countryside.
But the fact is, though, that Derby has this powerful figure in the sort of painting landscape. Very lucky to have a man like Joseph Wright, I should think.
Yes, I think there aren't many provincial museums and galleries that have an artist of this stature who remained a native of the town for most of his life.
Well, if Joseph Wright was a drinking man, this may well have been his pub, because after all he was born just along the street, and this is Derby's oldest pub, the Dolphin, which dates from the 16th century.
A short stroll from the old Dolphin, down Irongate, takes us up to Sadlergate, one of Derby's most attractive pedestrian streets. And here's another of Derby's ancient watering holes, the 17th century Old Bell. An old coaching house with carved oak beams. Its black and white timber facade was actually built in the 1920s. The brick building underneath dates from before 1691, and in 1745 the Young Pretender would have ridden past it as the Jacobite rebellion came to an end at Derby. A sortie into the old blacksmith's yard reveals another ancient building. This one was discovered behind a later facade when houses were being cleared for Derby's new assembly rooms. For years it lay under a tarpaulin until reconstructed as part of this development. Leading off Sadlergate is the Strand Arcade, built in imitation of the famous Burlington Arcade in Regency London. The arcade leads to the Strand proper, and thence to Wardwick, A Saxon name this, probably one of the oldest streets in Derby. 150 years ago it would have looked like a river, because on the wall of the Wardwick Tavern is this flood mark, which in 1932 was exceeded by a further 3 inches. Also in Wardwick, one of Derby's most striking houses from the 17th century, the Jacobean House of 1677. And just across the road from it is the City Museum and Art Gallery, where as well as the Joseph Wright paintings, other famous products of the town are also on permanent display. Quality porcelain has been continuously made in Derby for over 250 years, without a break, you might say. The earliest works were by Andrew Planchet, a Huguenot, and tradition has it that he stole the recipe and the method of porcelain production from the Meissen factory in Germany, but it seems more likely that he borrowed the skills from a London neighbour of his who made Chelsea china. These wild boars are typical of his more naive works and sold for 5 shillings apiece. Today at auction they'd probably fetch £500 for the pair. William Dewsbury succeeded Planchet at the factory in Nottingham Road, claimed it to be the second Dresden, and opened showrooms in London to attract the rich and the famous. Derby tableware was soon ranked among the best in Europe, and only Worcester was able to compete, so much so that Derby's showroom manager even suggested marking Derby's seconds with the Worcester factory mark. In about 1770 first appeared these biscuit or unglazed porcelain figure groups. Originally developed by the Sèvres china works on the continent, biscuit figures were to make Derby world famous, and the quality of figure groups like this has never been surpassed. Figure and landscape painting was first introduced at the end of the 18th century. Zachariah Ballman and William Hill, nicknamed Jockey from his habit of arriving at work on horseback, specialised in a watercolour style of painting. Perhaps more renowned were the flower painters, among them William Billingsley and William, better known as Quaker, Pegg. Their naturalistic style is among the finest in the story of Derby china. The present factory, incorporating the old Derby workhouse in Osmaston Road, began production in 1877. This factory was granted a royal warrant by Queen Victoria in 1890, when the firm became known as the Royal Crown Derby Porcelain Company, continuing a tradition of royal patronage begun a century before. And where better to shop for today's Crown Derby than at the Eagle Centre, where a covered market, the new Derby Playhouse and extensive shopping facilities cover 12 acres of the city, where once stood a network of 19th century housing. And even here, Derby's early supremacy in the wool trade is remembered. This is the Derby ram, a magical beast associated with the town's history for more than a century. A ballad tells how the ram was slaughtered and how the little boys of Derby came to beg his eyes to kick about the street, for they were football size.
Before the formation of Derby County Football Club in 1884, there used to be a Shrove Tuesday football carnival here in the town square. It wasn't so much football as hug ball, and believe it or not, this is the ball they used to use thanks to the Derby Museum. This is about 150 years old, and the townspeople who were going to take part used to divide into 2 teams, and the ball was thrown out to them from the now long demolished town hall.
Historian William Hutton, whose statue adorns this building on East Street, compared the sport to an election contest. I have known a football hero chaired through the streets like a successful member. Black eyes, bruised arms and broken shins are equally the marks of victory and defeat. Hugball was suppressed forever in 1846, but by then a much more significant event had taken place. The railway had come to Derby in 1839. By 1840, no less than 3 companies were operating, and in 1844 they amalgamated to form the Midland Railway Company. To accommodate their staff, the company built these terraced houses, and newly restored, they exist today as the world's first ever railway square, and yet not so very long ago their future was very much in doubt.
Heavens above, they wanted to put a ring road through the middle of them. And then, of course, everybody started getting excited, and they did a little bit of homework, and they found that these were the first purpose-built company houses built by a railway company in the world, let alone in this country. And just wasn't it sacrilege? Why on earth should they be declared unfit? Why shouldn't they, in fact, be made right? And why should the community who lived here before and was a very happy community, why shouldn't it come back again? There weren't people living within 150, 200 yards of this place before we did these cottages up.
What was the key to saving this area?
Well, unless you can have an area designated as a conservation area, then you really miss out on probably 75% of the money that is available. And so the first job here was to persuade people that not only did they not want to destroy the cottages, not only did they not want to put a ghastly ring road through the middle of it, but they were actually going to conserve it. I mean, this was a whole new ball game. Really, to this local authority, this is where it all started off, and they've gone on from there.
Just walking round it today, you get a clue almost to the lifestyle of the people who lived in these cottages.
It's a fascinating microcosm of social history, really, because these were purpose-built for railway employees, and it would appear from what little work we managed to do it, that even in those days they had a pretty clear pecking order, and the pecking order was not so much the stripes on the epaulets or anything like that, but it actually was the top of the door through which you went into your house, because the foreman and the overseers had some pretty fancy carving over the top of the doors, and the engine drivers had a little less, and the firemen and the people who went around with that little, you remember the hammer that they used to go and hit? I bet they had them in those days. They really had a very simple brick top.
And the brickwork itself is all in that lovely warm red brick, which I think is lovely. It's as nice as yellow stone, if you ask me.
One of the things that the Trust has always taken a great interest in is the very delicate touch that is needed to do this. And so, yes, the walls were all clean. They were cleaned terribly carefully with sand and a bit of wet. Another thing that we've tried to do is that we haven't overdone the pointing. We've tried to leave the pointing well into the bricks. I know this is a bit technical, but it's very important from the look of it.
You must be very proud of the whole place and the whole effect. So, what do you think it's done for Derby today?
Well, I don't know. I mean, one could be terribly arrogant and say, well, here, if it wasn't for us, Derby would be an ocean of wilderness and derelict bomb sites and things like that. I don't think that's the case, but, you know, it is such an exciting thing to think that not only have you started to create a community here, you've started a bit of inner city rejuvenation, which is so terribly important. But also you might just be setting a standard, and you might just be setting a scene that other people can learn from and do themselves.
At the turn of the 18th century, Daniel Defoe called Derby a town of gentry rather than of trade. But then, of course, he hadn't reckoned on Rolls-Royce and British Rail coming here, had he? And then, in 1977, in her Jubilee year, the Queen spent a day out in Derby when the town became a city. So why don't you come and see Derby for yourself? Goodbye. Well, here we are, just about ready to start another day out. And this time, I'm going to find out what to do from the experts. Oh, good morning, ladies.
Morning.
I've come to spend a day out in Buxton.
Yes.
And I think you're the very best people for me to come and talk to first.
right.
What kind of town is it?
It's an old Victorian spa town, so you'll find lots of fine old buildings. and it's surrounded by a beautiful countryside.
I've seen some of that already, driving through the moors.
Yes.
Where do you think I ought to start, though?
Well, perhaps the best place would be to work your way towards Solomon's Temple, which is a little tower on the hillside.
Out of the town again, but...
Yes, but not too far. It's a bit of a pull up there, and it'll be quite cold and windy. But it's well worth the climb to the top. You get a super view once you get up to the top.
They're right about the climb. Oh, and the view too, they're right about that as well. This is the high peak of Derbyshire, of course, and it's invigorating and fresh, and that's what people come to Buxton for. I feel at the moment as if I'm keeping the wind off Buxton, personally. And there's the town itself, nestling in its hollow. Deceptive, you know, really, because Buxton is 1,000 feet above sea level. In fact, it's Britain's highest spa town. Of course, there's nothing new about a day out here. Visitors have been turning up to take the waters for the past 2,000 years. The Romans were the first to discover the warm springs in the valley and named the area Aqua Ornamentii, meaning water sacred to the goddess of the grove. But its present name derives from much later times. The valley was once part of a royal forest where the deer would come to drink from the springs. Buxtown became Buxton, very straightforward. And now at last you can see what I'm standing on. This is what the ladies in Buxton told me to come and see. It's a late Victorian folly built by one Solomon Mycock to give work to the unemployed in Buxton, and they called it Solomon's Temple. The temple stands on the top of Grinlow Hill, and although it might look as innocent as its fellows ringing Buxton, it's not. In fact, it's a Neolithic cumulus, and not a natural hill at all. But the hill certainly provides an excellent viewpoint for the temple, and a pleasant walk through Grinlow Woods down into Buxton itself. It's here in the woods that I'm to meet the country park warden, David Alsop. Hello, David. Hello there. Hi.
Nice to see you.
And who's this?
Oh, this is the little dog that follows me everywhere. Her name's Mitzi, but
Hello,
as a
Mitzi.
country park ward, I don't boast about that.
You know, these woods are really quite a welcome relief from all the wind on top of the hill there by Solomon's Temple.
Oh, yes.
What used to be here?
Well, believe it or not, we're near an old quarry, and these were tips left behind by the quarry worker. They burnt limestone in kilns and cut down the original woodland to fire them.
And it was the Duke of Devonshire who planted the trees.
Duke of Devonshire?
Cover the eyesore, so to speak, was it?
That's right. There was so much sort of public protest about the mess that was made. Around about 1820, the estates of the Dukes of Devonshire, Chatsworth, had the wood planted, and this is the mature woodland we have today.
Well, they're very, very beautiful, aren't they? So when did it become a country park, David?
Well, with it being the last outpost of Chatsworth, he went into sort of reasonable neglect, and so the Duke of Devonshire, from Chatsworth, gave it to the people of the town in 1976, and it became a country park.
What kind of trees and plants can people see here?
Well, we're very restricted to our altitude. You know, Buxton is on a 1,000-foot contour, and we now are on 1,300 feet. So we've got to kind of go along with the trees that naturally regenerate, and that is sycamore, beech, ash and elm. And then any other trees become a little bit of a bonus to us, and of course we replant a lot.
You've got quite a few rare plants of one kind or another too, haven't you?
The main thing is the orchids. Obviously you don't have to over-advertise some of your rarer flowers, but we've got 8 varieties of British orchid in the woodland. Now, this little cottage here has got a lovely story.
Oh, yes?
Because one of the workers in the quarry every day used to bring a piece of stone home with him. And he slowly built this cottage. And when he built it, of course, it wasn't on his land. And eventually the estates of Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire, said, look, you know, you can live in this cottage for the rest of your days, but it isn't yours. And he'd built it out of a piece of stone brought from the quarry every day of his working life.
David's not just warden of the country park, but of something rather special. Paul's Cavern.
This is it. Big hole. Paul's Cavern. Well, yeah, 20 metres.
So this cave hasn't been blasted out of the rock with dynamite or anything like that?
No, the most significant feature that we always put over straight away, this is a natural cave. And it's one of only 2 in Derbyshire. All the others are lead mines.
Ah, by natural? You mean it's been formed by what?
By this river. The Derbyshire Wye flows through the cave.
Oh, this is a river, an actual river.
This is the Derbyshire Wye coming through here now.
I see.
So a completely natural cave formed by water in limestone.
And all this water pouring through the roof of the cavern all the time, it's rain
That's it, circulation water from above.
Yes.
And then, of course, depending on outside conditions, the river rises and falls according to the rainfall outside.
And we were walking just above the roof of the cave here when we were coming through the woods.
That's right, the cave's going horizontally to the hillside.
And what about this great thing hanging down here? What's that?
That great thing is a stalactite, the biggest in the cave, and you can see it's about 1.5 metres long.
The end of it seems to have been broken off.
That's correct. In Victorian times, rather sadly, the cottage owners nearby would let people come into the cave unattended and would let them throw stones around. And somebody no doubt wanted a trophy or an ornament, and they broke maybe 0.5 metre off the end, which is very, very sad, but that's the reason why it was made into a show cave.
I see. So what does that tell us about the age of this cave?
Well, for every inch, roughly, a rough guide, it isn't an accurate one, but a rough guide, for every inch of that formation, it took about 1,000 years. So we are talking in terms of some of the formation in the cave been at least 100,000 years, and sometimes up to 250,000 years.
Gosh, that's amazing, isn't it?
That's rather old.
Okay, can you please tell me what this extraordinary contraption is up here, David?
Right, well, when the cave was made into a show cave by the 6th Duke of Devonshire in 1853, it was first of all illuminated by candles and then by gas.
I see what it is now, the old gas elements up there.
That's it. Well, I wired the cave in 1976, being an electrician by profession, and I took out just 17 of those, but I remember the gas lighting and I thought, well, nostalgia for other people, and we're getting so many people back now who can remember the gas light of pre-1965.
Let's walk a bit further into the cave, shall we?
This is the famous poached egg chamber. First of all, on the top of all the stalagmites is this orange staining, which is iron oxide, quite unique within the caving world.
Where does that come from?
Well, probably coming from coal seams, because up on the Gritstone Hills there's known to be coal, and that might well be the source of iron.
I see.
But the overall unusual feature about this chamber is that it's made by water percolating through the lime tips. Remember when we were up in the woodland and I was explaining about the lime burning?
Oh, yes.
Well, they left behind these deposits over hundreds of years, and taking 300 to 400 years, water has percolated through the tips of lime and it's formed the formation in this particular chamber. What we've got here then are some very delicate straw formations, and the straws are completely hollow, just like a drinking straw, and then of course the thicker stalactites, formed in just the same way but quicker. But the main thing is to remember in this particular chamber, quite unique in the caving world, it's only taken just a few hundred years as opposed to many thousands of years. Now, the custodian of the day in 1853 had to dig this pathway through, and in doing so they found certain items, mainly of Roman interest, and this area here was called the Roman Chamber. Now, 2 years ago, we decided to dig here as a proper archaeological dig, and we found some rather remarkable items. Now, I've brought here 1 or 2 of the items, you see. First of all, there's a Roman brooch called a fibula, of a dolphin shape. There's one that would represent sort of a wheel.
Yeah, like a chariot wheel.
Chariot wheel.
It's still got the pin on the back.
Still got the pin on the back. And there, how's that for a nice Roman emperor with a nice Roman nose and a silver coin?
Silver.
And we found about 80 objects like this. Overall, 2,500 pieces.
As the finds at the cavern prove, Roman visitors were fairly common. Perhaps Buxton's warm waters provided the nearest thing to a holiday resort for weary legionnaires and centurions fighting to subdue the Brits. However, it was centuries later before the enormous money-making potential of Buxton's thermal waters was fully recognised. William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire and resident at Chatsworth, only a few miles away, had been to Bath, that other great watering place the Romans called Aqua Sulis. It set him thinking, for back on his Derbyshire estates, he owned the only other similar source of warm spring water in Britain. He began to capitalise on his good fortune. In 1780, he built this magnificent Doric-style crescent to cater for his wealthy visitors, with thermal and mineral baths at either end. Its resemblance to the Royal Crescent at Bath is unmistakable. Here, then, was a smaller Bath, set in the colder climes of Derbyshire. His plans went well. Soon visitors were arriving from far afield. The records show that some travelled from Scotland, Sweden and even Geneva to take the waters of this new spa town. Within only 5 years of building the crescent, Buxton had become the fashionable centre the Duke had hoped for, attracting the rich and the famous. I wonder whether it was gout or rheumatism, though, which attracted the Right Honourable the Lord Chancellor. By Victorian times, the water treatments had been considerably developed. Here, for instance, at what used to be the Peak Hydropathic establishment, a whole range were available, and Dr. Milner, in Fothergill's handbook, was claiming with total confidence that hydropathy would form one of the universal remedies of the future. Treatments included Turkish, Russian, vapour, hot air, needle and sitz baths, whatever they were, as well as electrical baths and douche massage. 60% of all cases of gout and rheumatism were cured, the literature claimed, and for those suffering incurable illnesses, a great alleviation was secured. Meanwhile, the town itself was being compared with the fashionable spas of Europe. The lords and ladies were drawn as much for the socialising and delicious gossip as for the somewhat rigorous water cures. In the gardens they took their leisure, eagerly tittle-tattling the latest scandals, no doubt. And if the Peak District weather proved too inclement, there was always the pavilion with its palm court orchestra and long conservatories. And should their rheumatism or gout prove too painful, they could always hire bath chairs to keep up with the social whirl.
The bath chairs cost £1 for half an hour to hire, and there was a man called a drawer to pull you along. Now, the drawers were licensed just like the modern taxi driver, and they wore an arm badge like this one, which is number 38, to prove that they were bona fide. Records of how much they charged for taking the warm waters of Buxton in the 16th century have survived. Apparently they charged an archbishop £5, a duke £3 10 shillings, a mere yeoman 12 pence. A commoner today, 50 pence. See you in the water. Of course, the great thing about coming to swim in Buxton is that you don't suffer from that poolside dither, wondering whether to go in or not because it's too cold. Let's find out what it's like. Ready? Ooh. It's beautiful. The Mary Queen of Scots used to come here, you know, because she suffered from gout and rheumatism. In fact, it's colder out than it is in. And she used to say it was like swimming in warm milk. I think she's right. Oh, Oh, David, that was one of the nicest swims I've had for a long time.
Good.
How warm is the water?
It's 82 degrees. We get it pumped up from down in the crescent at 82 degrees. And obviously it's dropped a few degrees by the time it gets up here, and we reheat it back up to the 82, the original temperature.
It's still a very nice, comfortable swim, though, isn't it? Do people come a long way to swim here?
Yes, they come from all over the country. Obviously it's well known throughout the country as being a spa town, and people come here for the spa water.
Has it got any sort of medicinal properties, you know, the water?
Well, we get several people phone up and say, well, their doctors have recommended us to swim in spa water and come here for that purpose, so presumably yes.
But you're not saying, you obviously can't say one way or the other.
Oh, no, but if you look back in the history with the Mary Queen of Scots and other people, they seem to have come here for that reason.
Having taken the waters, the gentry needed something else to entertain them. And in 1903, what many people regard as Buxton's greatest jewel began to rise. There's still absolutely nothing like it in the area, and it was the Opera House. Just come in and feast your eyes. The Opera House's present condition rather belies the state it was in only a few years ago, for it was in 1978 that plans took shape to restore it to coincide with the return of grand opera at the revival of the Buxton Festival the following year. For the first time for almost half a century, its true beauty was uncovered from years of dirt and neglect. Chris Barron, as the general manager of the Opera House, you have this amazing building to work with, but it must have looked a bit grim before you got your hands on it and renovated it.
Well, it was fairly dirty. I think it hadn't been touched for many years. No, you're quite right. It was a cinema for 30-odd years, in fact, since the first Buxton Festival, which finished in the war. I think it wasn't a very successful cinema, so they hadn't ruined much of the building. They were just about to brick up the proscenium and make 2 cinemas when someone said, you've got to stop now, I'm afraid, and keep the lovely old theatre.
What had been done to it, though?
It was fairly dirty. It had really been, I suppose, just very dowdy from days and days of dust and never being cleaned and very few people being in the cinema. I think probably in the 20s it was repainted in darker colours, and they just got darker and grubbier and nastier, and really lost the relief. So now you see the cherubs stick out. I mean, they actually are in profile, and you can see the beautiful fan shapes in the boxes and in the little landings in the upper circle, and they got very murky and lost their profile. Same with the glasswork. That was all cleaned up. Really, now it's a treat in the theatre. It's a good feature.
So it must have been a complete revelation to a lot of people, to how beautiful this theatre was.
Oh yes, I think so. That people were used to it. They went past it. It was a big building, a bit of a white elephant in a way, a bit of a problem to cope with. I think people were aghast when they came in and saw it in '79 for the first festival.
But you've been meticulous in restoring it to what it was. For instance, the patterns of the carpet were identical on it.
Yes, this is how the story goes. Yes, that's right. They say underneath the old liner and the red carpet there, they found a little bit of this and pulled it out, and someone said, oh, that's the original, and I think they checked on the plans. So they had the whole thing rewoven again in the original factory with the same number of emblems, I suppose, same number of crests on there. And some people say 14,000, and some say 16, and it grows every time you talk about it.
But Buxton must be really very fortunate to have such an opera house.
Well, it's extraordinary. It's a town now with 20,000 people. This place holds 1,000 people. It's an absurd statistic and economically absurd, so our audience is necessarily a wider audience than this. I think it's very fortunate. It's one of the marvellous things I think the town can sell it with for the future. We're looking for heritage and things, and here is a smashing bit of heritage.
The nice thing about Buxton is that there seems to be something interesting on every street corner, like this Victorian letterbox, for instance. And once you get here, whether by road or rail, you don't need to worry about transport, really, apart from Shanks's pony, because everything is so compact. That splendid building is the Devonshire Royal Hospital. In the 1880s, they were treating 3,000 patients a year there. But it started life, before it got that beautiful dome on top of it, as a stable block for the Dukes of Devonshire's 110 horses and accompanying grooms and stable lads. Even the horses enjoyed a very stylish accommodation in Buxton. The impressive dome was added in 1879, and at the time was the largest unsupported span in the world. The Devonshires made over the building in 1857, and the Devonshire Hospital and Buxton Bath Charity developed to assist the poor who sought treatment here. The warm waters are piped up from the Crescent to the hospital and are still in use in various treatments today. This was one of the hospital's Victorian drinking wells, but the building now houses a bottling plant, making Buxton water available to many more people throughout the country. Bob Littler showed me around and also explained just where that water comes from.
The water falls upon the hills, which is about 1,000 feet up around Buxton, and then runs down through limestones and can't escape out of those limestones because of an ancient lava flow. And then runs down to about 5,000 feet below ground. It then meets a geological fault, which then forces the water back up again, and it runs back up through other limestones, and it emerges in the town centre of Buxton. The water itself, when it comes to the surface, is sterile. All that we do is just run it through a filter as an extra precaution, and then put it straight into bottles.
What do you think the appeal is these days of drinking spring water?
Well, I think there's probably 4 main reasons why people drink it. It's certainly fashionable to drink mineral water, but that's become less and less of a relevant factor just recently. There is an increasing concern over the taste of tap water. It's perfectly pure and perfectly healthy, but very often it does have a taste to it. I think there's also a concern over the content of tap water in terms of things like nitrates, for example. And finally, I think perhaps most importantly of all, it's really a very pleasant product to drink, whether it's sparkling on its own or with wine, or drunk still, again on its own, or perhaps as a mixer with whiskey.
How many bottles of pure spring water are sold in this country today, do we know?
In litre equivalent bottles, it's about 50 million bottles currently, and that really compares with next to nothing in the early 70s.
But of course in Buxton, it's strange that people can go round to the square by the pump rooms and fill up their own containers.
Indeed they can, and I think they very often do, and in fact some people don't drink anything else but Buxton spring water.
Well, after all we've heard about Buxton's heyday as a spa town, how sad it is to discover that the old baths where the rich and the famous came to take the water cure are now derelict and, well, really almost unrecognisable. All we have are the old mats in front of the doors here, for instance, which if you scrape the mud and the old leaves off, you can just read, say, thermal baths. You see, Dr. Milner's forecast in Victorian times that the water cure would become a universal remedy, unfortunately, didn't stand the test of time. And there, above the highest balustrade of the Crescent, are the 5th Duke of Devonshire's coat of arms, the man who really started it all. And they too are now sadly decayed and almost unrecognisable. But if you're still determined to take the waters of Buxton in the more traditional way, then this is the place. Right in the centre of the Crescent, this beautiful fountain. It's warm. Tastes quite nice too.
In the Middle Ages, the waters were considered to have miraculous healing qualities and became a shrine for the crippled. The instant cures were attributed to St. Anne, Mother of the Virgin Mary and patron saint of the disabled. Across the road from the fountain is the old pump room, presented by the 7th Duke of Devonshire for later visitors who didn't expect such instant relief from their maladies. Today it houses a unique experience, the micrarium. Through specially developed projection microscopes, the visitor gains a rare glimpse of the unseen natural world around us. Revealed to the eye are the mysteries of plant cells, the structure of butterfly wings and snowflakes, growing crystals, and the antics of tiny living creatures. Its creator is Dr. Stephen Carter.
The purpose of it is to invite people in, ordinary folk, off the street if you like, and to give them the opportunity of exploring them for themselves the fascinating world that is only accessible to us through the microscope. It's a vast world, much bigger than the world that we normally see with our unaided eyes, and full of fascinating creatures, fascinating things, beautiful objects, and most people are totally unaware that it really exists.
The thing that the children find most fascinating are the live exhibits. How do you manage to show them?
The live specimens are mostly small animals that live in water. There is, of course, a vast population of creatures of this kind, but it is convenient, because we're using projection microscopes, to use transparent animals. This is the kind of living specimen that we like to show.
And the system is that the animal is projected from its slide onto a screen down below.
That's right.
So the children can really see the thing quite up close.
But not only that, they have complete control over the microscope itself. They can focus on the specimen, they can move it around so they can chase a particular animal that intrigues them and see what it gets up to. They can change the magnification. They can do everything that you can do on a normal microscope, but there is no risk of them doing it any harm, nor do they need to have any special skill, because it's all simple push-button controls that they're thoroughly familiar with in this day and age.
And although they're only such tiny microscopic animals, do they have to be looked after?
Of course they have to be looked after.
Almost like keeping chickens.
Certainly, yes. They're looked after very carefully. We treat them, my daughter particularly looks after the specimens. She says she treats them as her pets. And this is really the right way to go about it. They are looked at and seen to every day, but many of them stay with us for a remarkably long time. Some of these creatures have been with us for more than a year now, in the same preparations, being looked at by thousands of people.
Well, our day out's over. We're back where we started, for just across the road from the micrarium is the old mineral baths, the home now of the Tourist Information Office. Oh, I'm back.
Hello.
I'm shattered. I'm exhausted. I think I've been everywhere. I've been to Solomon's Temple, like you said, Windy. I've been to the Cavern, and I've been to the Opera House, and I've been for a swim, believe it or not, in the pool, and to the micrarium. So I think I've done everything.
Ah, have you been to the Transport Museum?
Oh, no.
Or seen the Adams ceiling in the library?
No.
And the Museum and Art Gallery?
No. I thought I'd done everything. It seems to me as if I need much more than one day out in Buxton. So when you're coming, I should give yourself a good week. But it's been very enjoyable. Thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello. Do you know, I've got a feeling there are going to be some lovely surprises on this day out. I'm not going to tell you where we are just yet until I've got rid of the car. See you in a minute. This city's done a great deal to remove the motor car from its congested streets, for it was the first place in the country to introduce a proper traffic control system, monitoring and speeding up the flow of vehicles around the inner ring road with the use of television cameras. And anyone who doesn't take my advice and leave the car and walk might well be rewarded by a previous Chief Constable, Sir Robert Mark, who created the traffic warden. So if you haven't guessed yet, we're in the city of Leicester. Surprisingly, you might never think of this sprawling industrial city of today as being an ancient town, but in fact we can trace its history for some 2,000 years. It was once a popular myth
that Leicester's name came from its founder, King Lear, but it's now more likely that it was derived from an old Saxon name for the River Soar.
When the Romans built the Fosse Way from Exeter to the Legion's headquarters at Lincoln, they had to cross the river here. They fortified that crossing point, and around the fortifications grew a settlement. That settlement became eventually the Roman town of Rattay.
And it was whilst modern-day building work started for new public baths that the heart of the old Roman settlement was unearthed, revealing the foundations of a marketplace and of their own baths. And today, the whole area is a museum.
So what's the importance of this site to Leicester, Jean?
It's one of the largest standing chunks of Roman masonry in Britain, apart from somewhere like Hadrian's Wall. The stone is local granite, with the exception of some of the larger pieces, which are millstone grit from Derbyshire. It was part of a much larger wall dividing the exercise hall from the business part of the baths.
But driving past on the inner ring road, it's extraordinary that it's still possible to miss something as magnificent as this.
I think that's true. You're either swept past in the traffic or you're stuck in a traffic jam, and it's easy to miss. The pattern of paths that you see here are not paths at all. They're the wall foundations of the various rooms in the bathhouse.
Jean, let's go inside the museum, shall we?
These floors were laid nearly 2,000 years ago, about the middle of the 2nd century, and they belong to private domestic houses. These pavements are the only bits which have survived. It has certain points of similarity with the Peacock pavement, and we think they were produced by the same workshop, which may indeed even have been based in Leicester. One of the most exciting experiences as an archaeologist for me was the discovery of these wall paintings. We found a complete wall, and this particular wall had simply fallen over. The first thing that we saw was painted wall plaster lying face up in the ground, and underneath that was the back of the wall plaster on the other side.
The earliest evidence of the Roman name for Leicester, Rattay Corritanorum, can be found on this garden roller. Did I say garden roller? I should have said milestone, because that's what it was. It was found 200 years ago at Thurmaston, and indeed narrowly escaped being used as a garden roller until they discovered what it was. Then it was used as a lamp standard and later carried across. And it says on it, 2 miles to Rattay.
Moving from the 2nd century remains of Roman Leicester, it's just a short stroll to discover one of England's oldest churches. Built originally by the Saxons, St. Nicholas is an interesting mixture of architectural styles. It was a common practice in Saxon times to use and reuse local building materials, and some Roman bricks, presumably from the adjoining site, can be seen in the construction of the tower. Over the last 1,000 years or so, the church has been rebuilt and modified several times, leaving it all a bit of a hodgepodge though. A quiet walk around the city will reveal that it's not just a concrete jungle, as some people would have you believe. Down on the banks of the river in the castle gardens is where Leicester's history really starts to unfold.
When William the Conqueror marched into Leicestershire after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he started to establish strongholds in all the larger towns. And this whole area was the site of a wooden motte and bailey castle, which was situated close to the river, conveniently for supplies and fresh water. That one lasted a mere 50 years, but it was replaced by a much stronger stone structure, and parts of the remains of that can still be seen along there, look.
And to think that this whole area, once a military stronghold, has now completely reversed its role and become a haven for total relaxation. The north entrance to the castle's inner bailey was the turret gateway. Dating from the early 1420s, it used to separate the Newark from the castle, both areas being totally enclosed and entirely separate from the rest of the town. The structure was partly destroyed during election rioting in 1832, and it seems that today's workmen are having another go at it now. The church of St. Mary de Castro, with its needle-like spire, once served as the chapel to the castle. And if you're lucky enough to get inside, as it's usually locked during the week, you'll discover why it's so large. In fact, it's 2 parish churches in one, complete with 2 naves and 2 altars. Near to one of the altars, you'll find 3 stone sedilia, designed as seats for the clergy. They're over 700 years old and are regarded as some of the finest examples in England.
Leicester has written a lot of its history down on plaques. This one, for instance, recalls the strange custom of whipping toms. It took the form of 2 groups of men. Now, one lot were armed with stout sticks, while the others defended themselves with heavy wagon whips. They were all cheered on in the ensuing scuffle by enthusiastic townsfolk. Well, it was supposed to celebrate the expulsion of the Danes from the city, but it got so barbaric that by the 1840s it was stamped out altogether.
The 14th century Guildhall used to be the meeting place for the Guild of Corpus Christi. This beautiful building has had a long and checkered history. It was once described as a gloomy Elizabethan structure, a narrowly missed demolition. The Great Hall is one of the oldest parts of the building. It's nearly 30 feet high, and its roof is supported without the need for central pillars. Do you know, these timbers almost echo times gone by? The hall was once used to celebrate the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, and has also played host to the town's library. The mayor's parlour was added when the building became the town hall. The splendid panelling and overmantel cost but a mere £23 when it was installed in the 17th century. And the large oak refectory table is worth noting, as its top, at over 25 feet long, is made from one single piece of wood. Outside, in the courtyard, there are 3 cells, dating from the time when the building was used as the town's prison.
In 1872, a local bylaw was brought in to close the pubs at 11 o'clock, and I think some frantic drinking must have been going on to beat the deadline, because in this one tiny cell, it is said, at the same time, they once crammed 17 drunks. Phew, I think they've left one of them behind. Hey, come on, Sonny, wake up.
Anyone you like for 20 pence.
Come on now, 25 a melon!
You know, Pally!
Steady off, you must. Everybody around here seems to be out shouting each other to me to get the customers in. Do you shout?
Not at all.
Why not?
Well, I find you don't have to shout if you sell quality.
You do a lot of shopping in the market?
Yes, I do.
How often do you come down here?
Mostly on a Fridays and Saturdays, you know.
What do you find special about this place?
Well, I think it's very nice, really, all around. All the people are all very nice, I think, and civil, and there you are. They're all right, as they say in Yorkshire.
Pick your own bunches. Any you like now, they're nice and sweet.
Why do you like a market opposed to the ordinary kind of shop?
Got more variety, so you can pick and choose.
They're a cheerful lot in here,
They are, very. Yes, they are.
Do you reckon that's typical of Leicester?
Yes, yes, I do. I'm born and bred in Leicester, so I do, yeah.
Right in the centre of Leicester is the 13th century parish church of St. Martin's, and you can hardly miss its spire, rising a majestic 220 feet above the rooftops. The church is now, in fact, a cathedral, because the town regained its city status in 1919, when the Diocese of Leicester was restored after an absence of nearly 1,000 years.
I wonder if I dare ask you, Provost, without upsetting you too much, whether now that your parish church has been dubbed a cathedral, whether the building really lives up to that?
Well, in some ways it's a very modest building as cathedrals go. It's not half the size of Peterborough, Lincoln, some of the others. But in its own way it's a very important historical building at the centre of Leicester. And of course it's ideally placed right at the centre of a diocese and of a city.
You certainly can't miss its tower, can you, wherever you are in Leicester?
I think about 220, 230 foot of it, designed by a man called Raphael Brandon, just over 120 years ago. Very fine. Somebody described it as one of the finest Victorian spires in the Midlands, and of course it replaced a medieval spire, much smaller.
But why did poor old Leicester lose its diocese in the first place?
Ah, well, a long and gruesome tale. That, in fact, Leicester is one of the oldest dioceses in the Midlands, and the first bishop, 680, a man called Cuthwin, or Cuthwinner, who later became Archbishop of York, a very celebrated church leader. And then at the time, I think it was, of the invasion of the Danes, all the bishops fled, as bishops sometimes will. And,
one doesn't blame them, really.
You can't blame them at all. And so Leicester diocese ceased to be a separate diocese, and later on, over the centuries, it became a part, think of Lincoln diocese, then Peterborough diocese, and it was refounded. They're always very keen to tell you it wasn't founded, refounded as a diocese again in the 1920s. I think you can see as soon as you actually walk into the building here, you begin to get the feel of this being a proper cathedral, as people would say, not just because of the proportions, but because of the history which realises surrounding you.
Those carvings are really quite extraordinary, aren't they?
Yes, they are, and it's really quite surprising that the Victorians, perhaps in their restoration, who were rather prudish in these things, left some of the carvings there, including the fun little man along there with his tongue sticking out and his tummy sticking out as well, which the children love to see. They're very witty. They're not the sort of thing which Victorians thought was quite proper for church. But we're delighted to have them. They are, in fact, exact copies of the 13th and 14th century carvings, some of which we have underneath the table over there, the originals of them.
The church actually seems to be plastered with tombstones of one kind or another.
Perhaps one of the best known of all the monuments we've got here is comparatively recent, only about 240 years old, and that's this beautiful memorial stone to Gabriel Newton. And the story is that Gabriel Newton's son died, and Gabriel himself was so overcome by this that he gave what was then an extraordinarily large sum of money, £3,250, been told it's worth something like £1 million in modern terms, to found a school for poor boys. And of course over the other side is the very reason why this is a cathedral at all. A church building is a cathedral not because it's the largest building in the diocese, but because it has the bishop's cathedra, which is an old name for the bishop's throne or bishop's chair. For me, most of all, this is not just a building, not just really a place of worship. It's both those things. It is, in fact, a centre of life and evangelism in the diocese, and I hope for the city and the citizens of Leicester as well. Now, before you go, you must come and have a look at this quite remarkable tombstone to John Fenton.
Yes.
The story behind it is that he had a fight with a Frenchman, a sword fight, and he was killed in this fight, and all the locals claimed he'd been unfairly killed, and that the Frenchman should have been committed as a murderer, but he wasn't, if you read the words there.
And he remains a sad example of the incompetency of juridical institutions.
To punish a murderer.
He left to mourn his untimely fate a mother, a widow, and 2 children. Belgrave Hall, built at the start of the 18th century by Edmund Craddock, is a rather unpretentious Queen Anne-style merchant's house. Today, it serves as a museum, reflecting the lifestyles in the 18th and early 19th centuries. This is the sitting room, or the drawing room. Do you know, you could probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of suites of chairs and a settee in this country which match up to the superb quality of these. They're rare because of the embroidery. It's original. It would have been done by the lady of the house with a few attendants, and they show people doing nice things like picking apples in the countryside.
They're also rare because there are people on the seats. It was considered bad taste to sit on people on embroidery, so normally you wouldn't have seen human figures on the seats of the chairs. On the knees of the cabriole legs there are lion masks. Now they enable the experts who know about these things to date these chairs to 1728 within 6 months, one way or the other. And you may wonder why they have these, well, cheap-looking gingham covers on the embroidery. Well, they are absolutely accurate too, and there's an illustration on the wall showing 3 gents of about 1740 sitting on gingham covers just like these in exactly this pattern. And they were, of course, to protect the embroidery, and that's why it survived so well up to the present day. This lovely bureau at the end of the room is English, about the same period, and it really is every small boy's paradise. That means me. Because apart from the drawers, everything else you pull out on this thing has got a secret compartment. Just about everything could conceal state papers or the family heirlooms. It's a beautiful thing, japanned, as they call it, painted in lacquer. Gosh, well, we've seen the elegance of the sitting room and the drawing room. I wonder how they lived on the other side of the kitchen door. What about the workers? Pam, it's hot in here, isn't it? Was it always so hot in the kitchen?
Yes, it was, because the fire was the main source of heat for all forms of cooking, roasting meat in front of it and boiling pots and so on top of the fire. The kitchen was really the best place to be because the rest of the house is extremely cold in winter. The fireplaces are tiny and give out very little heat.
Of all the many families who've lived in Belgrave Hall, when you come in the morning, which family do you feel most part of?
I think that Belgrave, as we look at it today, is probably fairly much as it was in the days of the Simons. John Simons bought Belgrave in 1720. The Simons had 11 children over a period of years. Not all of them lived here all at the same time, but nonetheless, the Simons were a large household. They were farmers. They would have employed a great many outside servants and farm workers as well.
So this kitchen would have been a real hive of activity.
Oh yes, they would have been cooking for, I don't know, perhaps 40, 50 people.
I've noticed also the row of bells along the kitchen wall there.
Yes, they related to the various rooms in the house, and each bell has a different tone, so that as a bell rang, the servants would know which room they were needed in.
So when the whole family were in, it must have sounded like a peal of bells in the church.
Quite possibly, quite possibly.
Out in the stable block, there's quite a surprise in store. Oh yes, this is fantastic, isn't it? What a coach. So this is how the other half lived, eh? And how they travelled too. This is the Bow Manor coach. It was made for the Herrick family of Leicestershire. And it was made in 1740 for £73, 10 shillings. It's said to be one of the finest 18th century coaches still left in existence. I'm not at all surprised. I think they'd have had a bit of a job parking it though in Leicester, don't you? By the end of the 18th century, Leicester had become a large and sprawling township. The Industrial Revolution introduced the stocking frame and the famous hosiery industry was born. As more and more factories sprang up, thousands of new workers flocked to the town for the promise of a guaranteed income. But unfortunately, the town became overcrowded, the river was polluted, and disease was rife. Right, are you ready for another Leicester surprise? Follow me. There we go. How about that? It's like discovering the engine at the centre of the earth or something. What is it? What is it doing?
Well, it's officially called a Wolf Compound beam engine. It was built in 1891. What it's doing now is being driven by steam, and you can see the flywheel over here being driven round and round.
It's a massive great thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. What it was built for, which is I'm sure what you're really interested in, was to pump sewage, Leicester's sewage, up to a treatment farm about a mile away from here. Most people are very surprised, and I think you were when you first came in, about how silent a stationary engine is. They're so used to railway engines on British railways when they still ran steam, being very, very noisy, and they're not quite used to a stationary engine just rumbling over. The only sound you can really hear is the sound of the bearings as it trundles round and round.
Do you ever get tired of this great thing going around?
I get very used to it, but not tired. A bit like the public who come here, it's very mesmerising watching this wheel go round and round and round. And we've seen the public in here on our special steam days stand for the whole afternoon, apart from the time they have to go for a cup of tea or something else, just watching the wheel go round and round, because it is so fascinating. When you look around, you can see the tremendous amount of Victorian decoration. There's actually gold leaf on this engine. I think how strange to put gold leaf on an engine that was just for pumping sewage, to which the public were never admitted when it was working as a sewage engine. And it's now run as the centrepiece of the Museum of Local Industry.
So how often can people see this wonderful machine going?
Well, it actually works around about half a dozen times a year because it is so expensive to actually run. But it's always visible in a static form every day of the week except Friday.
Bob, tell us about this great gobbling machine. What is it?
Well, it weighs 84 tons before you even asked me. I thought you might like to know that.
I'm not surprised.
And it's sitting here looking very large, as you say. And it's a steam navvy officially. That's what the proper title is. I suppose most of the public would think of it as a power-driven shovel. It has an 18-ton lift at the end of the bucket.
It can take 18 tons?
It doesn't take 18 tons of stuff. It has an 18-ton force at the end of the bucket. And it's about 1 3/4 cubic yards, something like that, of actual earth or rock or whatever it is it's going to dig.
It looks absolutely tireless to me.
It is, as long as you keep feeding it with about 10 tons of coal a day, so that's a bit expensive. It looks very, very early, and it's basically in design, it's almost a 19th century machine, but this one was actually built in 1935, and it's actually one of the very last of the line. I think it's one of the most exciting things we've got. It actually, to me, almost beats the beam engines, which is almost blasphemous, really, but it makes all the right noises.
Bob, you've shown me great steam engines and great beams thundering up and down, but this surely must be the real centre of Leicester's industry, isn't it?
This is what has made Leicester famous over the last 400 years or more, and what Leicester is still famous for, the hosiery and knitting industry. Well, what we're seeing is Martin knitting on an 1850s machine, producing basically plain fabric with a little bit of a fancy pattern in it, and he's making shawls or scarves. The industry itself started in London, but moved up to Leicester because of readily available, cheap labour. There was, at the time in the 1640s, non-guild, what you would think of now as non-union labour, a readily available supply of yarn.
Bradgate Park, only 6 miles away from the city centre, is such a change of pace it could be 1,000,000 miles away. It's Leicester's playground, some 800 acres of totally unspoilt parkland. It was a gift to the city back in 1928, and it's really marvellous to think that an area of such outstanding beauty has been left untouched for so many years.
I was amazed to see the number of people in the car park for a start, George. You obviously have a tremendous number of people driving out here to Bradgate.
Yes, well, we take over 1 million visitors a year.
Do you really?
And
from all over the Midlands?
All over the Midlands, yes. It is a very popular and attractive area.
What about Leicester people? They must like having this lovely green lung on their doorstep.
Well, Leicester people tend to treat it as their own backyard. I mean, they're very good to us, really. If they see anything going wrong, they will tell us straight away. Yes, I've got the greatest respect for this area.
Hello, we're stopping. What are we doing here?
Well, just here, if we can, over there, look, is that large lump of rock.
Yeah.
It's known in this park as the wishing stone.
Oh, does it?
I suppose the next question is, you're going to ask me if it works.
I am.
Yes, I thought so.
I just tried to think of 3 wishes to have. It doesn't work.
Well, help yourself, then you can possibly tell me later whether it works or not.
What's the river, George?
It's the River Lynn, L-I-N. One of the main entrances to the park, of course, where we've just come from, is Newtown Linford entrance, and the village of Newtown Linford is named after this river.
There seems to be quite a difference between one side of the river and the other.
Yes, well, one side is for the public with the picnicking. The other side is the deer sanctuary, where, of course, there's about 300 head of deer in this park, and that's one area that they have their peace and quietness during peak times, of course.
To breed and to raise their young?
Yes.
What kind of deer are they?
Red and fallow.
What about this place? Was it always a deer park?
Yes.
A hunting park?
Yes, both really. Very well-known hunting park and deer park, considering that the famous Grace family who lived at the house behind us.
Oh, the ruined house, yes, that's amazing. Which Grey family was that,
Lady
George?
Jane Gray's family. They lived here. Let's have a walk up, shall we?
Yeah. What are we going to see, George?
We're going to see the birthplace of Lady Jane Grey, who, if you remember your history, was the 9-day Queen of England. As she was beheaded in 1554, one of the main legends of the park is that they beheaded all the oak trees in the park in sympathy. And if you look around, you can see where a lot of the old oak trees have been beheaded.
Ah, what was the importance of this house then, George?
Well, it was one of the first brick unfortified houses in the country.
Unfortified, so
yes.
Obviously the owner of this house was a relaxed man. He had no enemies then.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but yes, it was. It's a sign of quite a time in history.
It seems pretty massive to me. Huge, in fact.
Well, it was over 200 feet from east to west. Very modern, had his own running water system, own sewage system, and we are talking of a period around about this house being completed, what, 1510.
Oh, this is fantastic, George. What an incredible view, isn't it? And that's Leicester over there.
That's Leicester in all its glory.
What we can see of it, it's a bit misty.
But look at the countryside between here and Leicester.
I should think it must have looked very much like this in Elizabethan times, wouldn't you think?
Yes, it must have
bracken, the woodland.
Yes, unspoilt countryside.
Right. I'm determined to get to the very top. What's the stone tower, George?
Landmark of Leicestershire, Old John Tower.
I think Old John Tower. I think it must be a landmark. When was it built and what's the...
1786.
Yes.
In memory of an old family retainer who was killed in an accident.
Must be pretty bleak up here in the winter, that's all I can say.
Very.
Well, thank you, George, for a spectacular end to this day out. Beautiful up here, isn't it?
Yes. What do you think to it all?
What, to Leicester?
Yes.
And Leicestershire?
Yes.
Beautiful. I've been really surprised at what a historic city Leicester is, and all those beautiful wide open spaces we can see from here. So thanks very much. And I think you ought to come and have a day out in Leicester, you know, and Leicestershire, and come up to Bradgate Park. You'll love it. Bye-bye.